August 1948, and a young preacher named George Vandeman was preparing to take the pulpit. That was 70 years ago, and since that time, Soquel Camp Meeting has convened every summer. In many ways, Soquel embodies America's camp meeting, a timeless tradition of faith intersecting with culture, pleasure with praise, and truth within tradition. Camp meeting is so valuable we believe it should be shared not just once, but all year long. That is why the Central California Conference leadership team has produced the Best of Soquel. Our special made-for-TV editions showcase the best Soquel has to offer, while providing for you the best of Soquel programming from the comfort of your own home. These newly released programs are our gifts to you, and the best part is you don't have to register an RV, pack a suitcase, sleep in a tent, or so much as leave your front door. You can literally go to camp meeting right now from the comfort of that favorite armchair. We invite you today to sit back, relax, let the Holy Spirit in, and enjoy the best of Soquel today.
We're members of Sunnyside Seventh-day Adventist Church, and they're probably the most awesome church family there is. Very much ministry-oriented and wanting to reach out and help other people. And I feel like every time I walk into church, I'm surrounded by love. My center of influence has definitely been channeled into the Highlander Outfitters at McLean High School. That is where I see a great need, where I feel like God has called me to, and where I want to make a difference here. I remember when I was 7, and it was Christmas Eve, and my family was all around downstairs, and I remember feeling the need to go upstairs and just talk to God and thank Him for sending His Son to be born on this earth, and just telling Him I wanted to serve Him the rest of my life. The way I grew up with not having much in the way of clothes, I believe has influenced how and my desire really to do what I'm doing right now, because it hurt a lot when the kids would make comments when we didn't have the newest clothes, and I really don't want other kids to have to face that. So we try and get clothes here that are in style so that the kids don't have to be embarrassed. Okay, Wednesday, that is one of the highlights of my week, because I love what we do here. I'm usually up pretty close to the same time in the morning, and I'm usually getting clothes together, getting shoes together, getting the things I've had at my house that I've washed to bring into McLean High School for our Highlander Outfitters here. And I'm throwing in a couple things for a quick lunch and meeting people at the church, making up food boxes and picking up more supplies there that we need to restock here. And sometimes stopping at a store or two on the way to pick up stuff we need, and then coming into the high school. I try and get here about noontime. I usually here till about 3:30 in the afternoon. We had a girl come in with a vice principal here just a few weeks ago that had suddenly found herself in a homeless situation and was not sure where she was going to be able to go to live. And she needed a lot of basic living things, and so we helped her with some clothes. And at first she was very hesitant. She didn't want to take anything. And then we told her, no, this is what this is for. Someday you'll be able to give back. So you look around and see what you can find. And we kind of helped her go through things. And eventually she ended up with several outfits. We gave her toiletries, snack foods, all those kinds of things. So she had something that basically met the needs that she had. When I'm able to help a student like this, it just makes my day. It's an amazing feeling because you know you've made a difference. And one of my favorite statements from Desire of Ages is, Christ lived to bless others. And that's what I want to do. That is what gives me the greatest joy, is being able to help somebody else. I would like to say to every Christian, if you are not doing something to serve others, you're not going to be happy, not truly happy. The greatest joy is in doing something for someone else. I think Christ has put the desire in my heart to do what I do, because this is what brings me the greatest joy. And seeing the difference that it makes in the lives of those around me is probably the most important thing, and I feel like I'm doing what God has called me to do. I have to give Him all the credit, because I was born like this, I guess.
recovery. Today's topic. Some people don't like this topic, you know that. Had a lady come up to me and say, I don't want to talk about loss and grief, and it makes me sad. I pointed out to her that we control, to a large degree, how we feel over time. So if she's choosing to be sad, she'll be sad. If she's choosing to think different thoughts, she'll change the way she feels. She didn't agree with me. Not too long later, a man came up to me and said, I'm going to skip this section because I don't like to talk about loss and grief. He said, it reminds me that I couldn't fix everything. And that's very much aligned with many male brains, because the male brain is, in general, a fix-it brain. It wants to fix things. And if it can't fix things, especially in terms of loss, then often it'll get angry and want to stuff it. So let's talk about a very important topic, because every human being on this planet experiences loss. Some big losses, but often accumulation of smaller losses that really over time have a huge impact. And what research says that we can do about it. A couple of caveats. As I mentioned, every brain is unique. I try to say that every session. No two brains on the planet alike, as different as the person's fingerprint, which means that the losses they recognize will be unique to their brain. Sometimes something will occur, and for one person, it's the end of the world. And for the other person, it's, boy, that's a relief. I don't have to do that anymore. So it's very unique, which means that recovery for every brain is unique as well. There are some commonalities. We'll be talking about those commonalities, because as human beings, our brains actually are more alike than they are different. But I try to point out the differences, because often we can figure out easily how we're alike. But the differences sometimes have nuances that, if we miss, make life a little more challenging for us. You do not know how another person feels when they talk about loss. You only know how you feel when you experience a loss. So it can be generally unhelpful when you're talking to somebody and say, I know exactly how you feel. No, you don't. And they know you don't. You may have some general idea from your experience of how they might feel, but you do not know. So I try to avoid even saying that, because it makes, it sounds like you are so smart that you know everything if you know how somebody else feels, and you don't. And above all, especially if you're talking about loss in relation to death, avoid euphemisms. People don't want to use the word died. Not sure of the reason. They don't want to talk about death. And so we have all of these euphemisms. And I really understood how unhelpful this was when my father died. And people came up to me and said things like, well, I hear your dad has gone to a better place. Really? I saw him put in the coffin and put in the earth, and that's a better place? Not helpful. Cross the river Styx. Okay, I never learned about the river Styx in geography. Where was that? So get rid of the euphemisms. Be real. I didn't shed a tear when my father died for 3 months. It was so painful for me. And people kept giving me all these euphemisms which were not helpful. And one day, there was a knock on the door to my office, and a colleague of mine walked in and said, I just got back from a 3-month sabbatical and heard that your dad died. all of the floodgates opened and I started crying. And she said, I have no idea how you feel. I just know how close you were to your father, and it must be awful. Okay, that can help somebody recover. So loss 101, what is it? It can be defined as the state of being deprived of what you had, or thought you had, or wanted to have intensely and really hoped it would happen. It's universal. Every brain on this planet experiences loss. As I said, it's different for every brain. Your loss might not be a loss for me, but we all experience loss. It's very subjective, meaning sometimes the loss is real and sometimes it's imagined. Sometimes it's rational, sometimes it isn't rational. And it's definitely different strokes for different folks. So once you understand that loss is not loss for every brain, it can actually help you deal with yours better and be a little more empathetic. It's ubiquitous. Loss is ubiquitous. I like these words. I like the way they sound. So loss can be physical, something you can see or taste or eat or drink or handle. You can lose a body part. You can lose movement. I have lost 2 body parts. I'm the proud owner of 2 titanium hips. In this case, the loss was to my benefit. When I came out of surgery, my 6'6" orthopedic surgeon, who I love to pieces, said to me, well, Arlene, you have better hips than you were born with. And that, to me, is a gift. You can lose freedom from pain. You can lose your home, as in earthquakes or other disasters. Your keys, your glasses. How much time do we spend looking for keys and glasses? I tell you, the other day I was lecturing and the women's restroom was not working, so they told all us women that we could use the men's restroom. And I set my glasses down, unfortunately, on the deck by the sink. But because I was looking around to see who else was in there, I forgot all about them. Do you think I remembered I'd left them in the men's restroom? They may be still there for all I know. You can lose things financially. Anything can be a loss. And we need to recognize what those are in our life. But if it was only physical, that would be one thing. Loss may also be abstract. That's one of the problems as people begin to go into dementia. They begin to lose their memories. They forget who they are. I knew one man who asked the nurse to write his name down on a card, and he put it in his pocket. And when he'd meet somebody and they'd say, my name is Joe, what's your name? He would pull out the card and say, my name is Leslie. And I dreaded the day when he didn't remember he'd put the card in his pocket. So it can be very abstract. It can be an idea that you really thought was right, and then you find out it isn't. I see this with kids all the time. They've been taught there's a Santa Claus and an Easter Bunny. And then all of a sudden they realize that they were lied to. And it can be a big loss for some of them. Some kids even said to me, I don't even care about Christmas anymore because there really is not a Santa Claus. And I tend to think it would be helpful if those children had been taught there was a St. Nicholas, and he left gifts for children. And in our culture, every year, we celebrate St. Nicholas and we give each other gifts. Instead of growing up thinking that there's a real Santa Claus and have it be this big shock that they were lied to when they lose the idea that that really exists, and so on and so forth. So just remember that it encompasses far more than physicality. It's abstract, it's mental, it's emotional. Sadness is the core emotion that signals you've experienced a loss. And sometimes you don't even realize it's a loss until you start feeling sad. And then I ask myself, ooh, I'm feeling sad right now. What did I just lose? What am I losing? What am I looking forward to that maybe I'm not going to get? And it can help you start processing this much more quickly. On the emotion staircase, sadness is the bottom step. It gives you energy. All of the emotions, each one gives you energy to manage whatever that emotion is wanting to give you information about. So sadness gives you energy to help you label, describe, and recover from the loss successfully, because the goal is recovery, not to hang on to that loss in sadness the rest of your life. What we find is that many people in their busy lives today focus on big losses. You know, my dad died. My neighbor's house was seriously damaged in the earthquake. Mine wasn't. What a blessing. You know, earthquakes and natural disasters often are sort of randomly selective. And it's interesting to see that pattern. They fail to recognize the little daily losses that can accumulate, like a long commute. I had a girlfriend once who commuted an hour and a half in the morning to work and an hour and a half home at night. She lost 3 hours a day of time with her family at home. And those kinds of things are cumulative. I want to say some things several times because research shows that it takes the average adult hearing something 3 or 4 times to really get it. So I'm going to say it again. You must identify, label, and describe a loss in order to be able to deal with it effectively. One of the statistically significant strategies for dealing with loss is to create a personal loss line. And I have done that, one of the best things I've ever done. I just took about 28.5 by 11 sheets of paper and taped them together and laid them out on the floor and started identifying the losses in my life. And sometimes the loss starts before you're born. In my case, it certainly did. So I put the date, what was the event, what was the loss, what was the gift, what did I get from that loss? Because you always get something when you have to give something up. And then have I grieved that loss or not? So this is the first loss I could identify. My mother had been left in an orphanage twice when she was a little girl because her parents could not find work and could not feed the 4 children. The first time was when she was 5, and she was in there until she was 8. And then they came back and got her, and a couple years later she was in again for almost 2 years. The family doesn't think she ever recovered from that. It colored her whole childhood. It impacted her ability to hope and trust. So when she and my father married, she wasn't terribly interested in children. She liked going with him to visit people in the hospital and so on and so forth. And then after they'd been married a couple, 2.5 years, my father started talking about wanting a child. This according to her older sister, not according to her. We never had this discussion. So her older sister said, my father would say, I think it's time we had a child. I want to have a child. And my mother would say, I don't particularly want children. I don't think we need children. I don't know what they talked about before they got married, but apparently it wasn't about having children. And he kept at it. And finally, according to my aunt, she said, okay, I'll get pregnant. I'll have one child. It's going to be a boy. It will be born on your birthday, and you're going to help raise it. Fine, he says, just give me a child, whatever. So she got pregnant. She forgot to tell me about those parameters. So when I came out the chute, it was not on my father's birthday, January 26th, it was on February 1st, late. I was not a boy. And she went into a major postpartum depression that lasted for months. I felt that obviously because I had horrible colic. My father would walk the floor with me all night, trying to get me to calm down. He'd bring in different women during the day to take care of me while he was at work. And now we know that the fetus knows whether it's wanted or not. My mother was ambivalent, I think, about wanting a child. She certainly wanted only to do this once, and it would be a boy. And I smashed those hopes. And since I was late, for years, when my birthday would come around, my mom would say, and you know, this is not anything against her, I'm just telling her what it appeared her perceptions were. She would say to me, if only you had been born on your father's birthday, one birthday cake would have done for both of you. Okay, now I think that's hysterical. Back then, I didn't think it was so funny. So that was one of my early losses. But what was the gift? The gift was that I bonded with my father in a way that most babies never get to bond with. And I had a reasonable relationship with my mother growing up, but we never ever bonded. Because about the time, you know, I was feeling, you know, I was an only child, loved being an only child. Whew, you know, that was great. And then my parents screwed up and had my brother. So there's my second big loss, because now I'm no longer the only child. And she had her boy. And I pretty much stopped existing for my mother when my brother was born. I realize now that I'm not sure she thought boys were better than girls, but she was very bright, would have loved to go to college much earlier in life, and wanted, desired, wished she had the advantages that often seem to accrue more easily to males in this society. But back when you're 3.5 and 4, what do you know? So, I've grieved all of that. It is what it is. I can tell you that is just a fact of my life. But it was important to go back and uncover that so that I would not have any enmity between this darling little baby boy who looked just like her and now seemed to be the pin in the family. So do this work. It will pay you huge dividends. Now, sometimes the loss can be fixed, sometimes you can come to accommodation, sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. And people talk about replacing a loss. You can never replace a loss, ever. Had a darling little poodle, and she finally died of old age. Somebody said to me, are you going to replace her? And I go, she's irreplaceable. I can't replace her. Yeah, I might get another dog, but I won't get her. So this business about replacing it is a fallacy. If you don't identify and grieve the loss and recover, you're going to wish you had someday, because there's going to be long-term outcomes for that. Because loss is not just physical, it's not just ideas, it has mental, emotional, physical, cognitive, behavioral, social, philosophical, spiritual dimensions. Just go on down the list. And loss requires grieving and recovery in order to live life to its fullness on this planet. Unfortunately, ungrieved loss is cumulative, meaning your brain recognizes the loss, but if you don't grieve it and recover, you develop what we call a slush fund in your brain of unresolved emotional pain. And that puts you at risk for something small happening and all of a sudden you overreact. Talk about jot behaviors. O for overreacting. And people look at the individual and go, well, that was a little tiny thing. You stubbed your toe. Hello? And look at this huge reaction. It has nothing to do with stubbing your toe. You just lost a little freedom from pain, and all of this unresolved slush fund comes rushing forward. And often in that situation, you create a mess that now you have to clean up. Males are more likely to develop a slush fund of unresolved loss than females, although it can happen to females. But males tend to stuff it more easily, especially if they can't fix it. And I really encourage males to do their loss line so that they can get some of this slush fund resolved. So what's grief? Grief is just intense suffering. You suffer because you have experienced a loss. It can also include the feelings that are hard to resolve. For example, when my father died, I desperately missed him. I still miss him. Sometimes I just pretend in my mind that I'm calling my dad on the phone and saying, you know, Dad, I have to make a decision about this. Sure would be helpful if I could talk to you about it. And of course, I know that I can't. But believe it or not, within a couple of days, something will pop into my mind that my father said to me when I was young that answers the very thing that I was thinking about. On the other hand, I was relieved in a way when he died because his quality of life had gotten pretty poor. And I was glad that he no longer had to watch himself deteriorate. But sometimes that feels a little bit disloyal. It's not disloyal. It's I want quality for people's lives. And if they no longer have it and they die, then it's a relief that they don't have to deal with that. Unfortunately, people, as I already mentioned, want to replace the loss. If you do that, first of all, you can't replace it, but if you do try to fill the void quickly with something else, you may never grieve. And because of the emotional pain, it's easy to get involved with addictive behaviors when you experience a loss. Oh, it's easy to blame and complain. You know that blame is just an attempt on your part to display some of the uncomfortable feelings you are experiencing onto somebody else. If you can make them feel bad, then you don't feel quite so bad. Oh, it's so ridiculous, but we always do that. I was in another country speaking, and I got there early as usual, and the PA system wasn't working. And I said to the stage manager, there's no way that I can speak to 2,000 people without a microphone. And one of the technicians says, well, I'm blaming you for this. I said, I don't even know where the PA is. Oh, he says, I don't care. I'm blaming you anyway. I says, but I didn't do anything. It's not my fault. He says, I didn't say it was. I'm just telling you I'm blaming you. Okay, that's very helpful. And apparently it made him feel better, but it certainly didn't resolve anything. Oh dear, and so when we get involved in those kind of behaviors, we often make very poor choices, and then we have to have the consequence of those choices.
Greetings and welcome to the Best of Soquel. My name is Ramiro Cano, President of the Central California Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. The pin of inspiration shares the following. The camp meeting is one of the most important agencies in our work. It is one of the most effective methods of arresting the attention of the people. Volume 6 of Testimonies, page 31. The Central California Conference has had a very long tradition with our annual camp meeting ministry. We can trace it back for over 138 years in our conference territory. For the last 70 years, camp meeting has been held in our conference center in Soquel, California, near Santa Cruz. Camp meeting continues to be a transformative blessing, embodying old-fashioned tent revival evangelism while simultaneously sharing God's Word through a variety of inspirational and riveting speakers. Last year alone, the Soquel Camp Meeting pulpit was host to over 71 hours of live television broadcasting for both local and streaming to a worldwide church community of more than 96 countries, transporting the hope of God's soon return and the comfort of Christ's love to the furthest places of the world. It is my honor and my privilege to make the Best of Soquel available to you. At the same time, I invite you to become part of the Soquel legacy by partnering with us in our evangelism fund. Each year, Soquel Camp Meeting goers collect funds to propel evangelism in a variety of ways. To do so, go to Central California Conference's homepage, centralcaliforniaadventist.com. Even $1 a day is of great value to God's work. These gifts are 100% for evangelism. We invite you to also download our app, CCC Space SDA. Through it, you can enjoy many video sermons. We also have a prayer wall where you can submit a prayer request. So, dear friends, wherever you are today, I invite you to sit back, let the Holy Spirit lead, be transformed by the message, the prayers, and the testimony segments. Catch and enjoy the Best of Soquel.
Some people, when they experience loss, especially loss that involves death of a loved one, they either go to anger or to sadness, and they stay stuck there. If they go to anger, that can turn into bitterness. If they go to sadness, that can turn into chronic depression. And either one of those can contribute to ill health. And some people check out of life, period. Either they just are apathetic and stop living, or they die because of immune system suppression, illness, disease, or they kill themselves because it's just too painful for them. None of those options appeal to me. Males are socialized that anger is okay. It's okay for men to be angry. It's masculine. It's not considered masculine to admit to fear or exhibit sadness unless they've gone so far that they're just flat out depressed. When a male, in general, bell curve of distribution, 2/3 of the population, the research applies not to every brain, but to the majority of the brain. When males experience a loss, they tend to just stop at anger. They often stuff it, which begins this slush fund accumulation of unresolved grief. If they can't fix the loss, and often they can't, certainly not when it involves death, birth defects, things like that, they often want to distance themselves physically and or emotionally from whatever reminds them of the loss, because with a fix-it brain, it feels to them like they failed. And that's one reason that couples often break up when there's a serious loss, because he can't fix it, and he's out of there, because it reminds him that I couldn't fix this. And if they want to stay together, sometimes they actually need to buy a different house. Do something to change the environment so it doesn't completely continue to trigger reminders of, I couldn't do this. And in general, rather than verbalize the loss, males tend to act it out. You know, I mentioned kick the cat, slam the door, yell at their spouse, go out and have an accident in the car, whatever. You know, have an affair, become addicted to pornography, whatever. Just get that off my mind. And males need to realize that it's helpful to find another male that you can verbalize it to rather than always going out and acting it out. Females usually go straight to sadness. Their risk is that they can be so sad and so enmeshed in the loss that they forget they have other family members. I can't tell you the number of young people that have been in my office saying, you know, my younger brother drowned, and mom doesn't even know we exist. She just sits in her room and cries. And she's really abandoned the other children because of her grief and unable to deal with it. Or because women they actually need to talk about something so they know what they're thinking. You know, they need to get it out in front of them. And they'll get stuck in over-rehearsing, talking about it and talking about it and talking about it and talking about it until people are sick of hearing them talk about it. So they need to rehearse it, but then get on with life. Do some purposeful action and recover. That's the reason that you can have relational discord when males stop at anger, women go clear to sadness. But you can make a different choice and you can help each other. He can say, you know, I'm angry that there was nothing I could do about this. And she can go, I understand that. And I just can't seem to get out of crying about it. And together they actually can help each other grieve and recover. So some recaps about male-female differences. Women are more likely to have a social network of friends with whom they can discuss the loss. In one large study, and I may have mentioned this earlier, the average woman has 9 individuals that she feels like she could call and talk to about almost anything. The average male has 1, and that's his spouse if he has one. So now we have a couple with a major death, one of the children, someone else they were close to. She's talking about it to her network. He's upset because he couldn't prevent it or fix it, so he's out of here. Now he's lost his only support. He's out there on his own. So it's not good or bad, right or wrong. It's what is in many cases, and once you can identify that, you can make a different choice. Women tend to have an experience-oriented grieving style. What does that mean? They rehearse about it. They want to talk to somebody about it. The downside is that they often think talking about it is enough. Now, rehearsing is not recovery. It's just rehearsing. It's important to get it out, but you can get addicted to rehearsing. Males have a goal-oriented grieving style, meaning, I want to fix it. I want to somehow make up for this. I want to do something. It's not just enough to sit here and talk. I have to do something. And so it can be helpful for males to get involved with some type of activity that might prevent what happened. I mean, that's how a lot of things have changed on this planet. This accident happened, and now what can we do to see if we can prevent that happening in the future? And they don't talk about it, and they probably need to rehearse it at least once or twice. Females on this planet are socialized to express grief through words, tears. Unfortunately, some get attention by their tears, and so they keep turning on the faucet because they get attention, and the attention helps take their, thoughts away from what happened. Males often get depressed. If they can't fix it, and if they don't run away, they get depressed. But you won't see it as depression. you will usually see it as anger. They tend to isolate. They get irritable. And you wonder, how come they're so irritable? Every little thing is a problem. Well, it's their depression, but it's not expressed in the same way that females do. We mentioned that sometimes females forget about other people in the family, other children, pets, husband, extended relatives. Many women in their grief do not take good care of themselves. They don't eat right, they don't exercise, they don't get enough sleep. That is not going to help with recovery. Males tend to escape, literally, metaphorically, physically, emotionally. They often become addicted to television movies, for example, because it takes them away from the conscious thought of what happened. They can get too involved in sports. They can become addicted to sexual activities or computer games. They can overeat. They can become involved with some kind of drugs. They can actually get too much sleep. They just zone out by sleeping. So we've got different strokes for different folks based on gender. Women tend to blame themselves when something happens. You know, if only I had done this, if I had not done that, then maybe this wouldn't have happened. Unhelpful. Most people do the best they can at the time with what they know, so that's unhelpful. Men tend to try to blame others. And it's probably his fault, or I'll bet it's your fault. I remember one couple whose only son disclosed that he was gay. Now, that was a loss for that family because the father expected the son to go into business with him. The mother was wanting lots of grandchildren. Doesn't mean she won't have any, but it changed their paradigm. And the father was livid. And this is what he said to his mother, the boy's mother: "It's all your fault. You had him last." Well, that was unhelpful, but that's the tendency, and if you know the tendency, you can make a different choice. So what's recovery? Recovery 101. It's simply the process of learning to feel better after you lose something. You can recall the loss without that deep, penetrating, painful sting of the grief. I can pretty much tell you anything that happened in my childhood now that's just an item in my history book, meaning I have very little emotion around it anymore. I've grieved it, processed it, recovered. I'm sure other things will pop up. They do regularly. I remember something I had completely forgotten. But that's what it's all about. You start to feel better and move on in life. And when you think of it, you don't get that all-encompassing, crippling pain. Sometimes you can really help others because you've gone through the experience. And you're more likely to deal more successfully with subsequent losses. It's like you're developing the skills to help you work through that. When you're dealing with other people who are experiencing loss, I've already mentioned a couple of things. You know, dump the euphemisms. They don't help. Sometimes saying nothing is all you need to do. Sometimes just going and sitting with somebody who's experienced a loss, just being there, thinking positive, helpful, kind thoughts toward them is all you need to do. You don't need to talk. You need to be real. I don't know how you feel because that's never happened to me. I can only imagine how bad it is. If you want to talk to me about it, I'm really willing to listen. And then shut up and listen. You know, some people say, I'm willing to listen, and 2 words out of the other person's mouth, and they're going, you know, something like that happened to me. You know, let me tell you about my experience. They don't want to hear about your experience. They're in the middle of loss. And we often do that because we're so uncomfortable with loss. So learn to just be quiet, just be silent, and listen. Ask what you can do to help. Sometimes it's amazing what people want. I was sitting with a good friend of mine in the hospital who'd had a horrible car accident in which her husband was killed. I was just listening, and after a while I said, anything I can do for you, anything that I can do to help you, tell me what it is. I could not believe what she said. You know, my husband loved plants. Our porch room is just filled with plants. I'm worried that they're not getting watered. Would you water the plants? Who would have guessed that she wanted somebody to water her husband's plants? Totally happy to do that for her. And sometimes you can just say, I didn't know the person very well who died, that you've just lost. Tell me about them. And just listen and let them talk. And especially if they're female, it gets it out in front of them instead of just banging around in the trunk of their mind. And as one woman says, I don't know what I'm thinking till I hear myself saying it. And that's often very true, so give them that opportunity. Dump the myths related to grief, and there's so many of them. Grieve alone. Oh yeah, that's really helpful. It works for both men and women. Give it time. Sadness resolves on its own. I'm here to tell you, it does not. Recovery is a process. I don't care if it's 50 years. If you have not gone through recovery, it's right there. It has not resolved on its own. I met a woman once who was 91, asked her to tell me about her family. She burst into tears and she said, my son died at birth. And I said, oh, when was that? 72 years ago. Never been through recovery. Never come to terms with the loss. It impacted her health. And then some people say, don't cry, be strong, buck up. Well, for some brains, tears are extremely cathartic. The right frontal lobe of the brain behind your right eye has no language. It has intuition, it has the ability to meditate, pray, which is a form of meditation, has the ability to visualize, to mentally picture things in your mind's eye. It expresses emotion through tears. It's the only one of the 4 chunks of cerebral tissue that does that. So there are some people who will be grieving mightily and never shed a tear because that's not their area, that's not where their energy advantage lies. Some brains just don't hardly ever tear up. And other brains, it's like, they're trying to shove some Kleenex up the faucet all the time because any little thing will bring tears. So don't cry or you must cry. That's very individual. This business about inappropriate loyalty also needs to be looked at. Some people only want to remember the good times. Let the sleeping dogs lie. I say sleeping dogs just proliferate fleas. It is not disloyal to recognize a life with the happy and the sad and the good and the bad. Actually, the people who grieve the best, the healthiest, are the ones who can do everything. Well, that happened, that wasn't too good, but we sort of learned to laugh about it later in life. It's not disloyal. And you will not stop the pain by trying to replace the loss. So what are the recovery goals? verbalize appropriately, both males and females, take constructive action, get on with life. Engage in grief recovery because it doesn't resolve on its own. Create a Purim, or Purim as some say, a memorial. You know, when you read the story of Queen Esther, they created this annual holiday to remember the good things that had happened to them and rejoice. So do that. Have a day every year where you remember the person and rejoice that you had them for as long as you had them. And do something to help somebody else in a similar situation. Survivors often focus on the loss of the tangible presence. You know, my father is not here. I cannot reach out and touch him. But the good news is that you can do something to keep their memory alive. And when you don't, when you're just sitting in a corner crying or going out and, you know, having another car accident, is that honoring your loved one? I don't think so. You honor that life by living a life well lived. Because I would never want somebody not to keep living simply because they'd known me and I died. You know, we talk about genetics and epigenetics. Genetics are chromosomes and genes, and epigenetics is the cellular memory. And research shows that once two systems come into energetic contact, you know, we're just energy, two people exchanging energy. They are connected forever by the cellular memory of their connections, which means that we carry our ancestors within us, and the experiences that we've had with people close to us are within us as long as we live. Paul Pearsall, who's doing wonderful research, wrote this: cellular memory is a form of energy. As with matter, energy is not destroyed, so information stored at the cellular level is retained indefinitely and passed on to your biological descendants. So here's a picture of a cell, and you can see the double helix, that's the chromosome and genes part, and you can see the little protein strands in the cell nucleus of any cell in your body that has a nucleus. And that's where behavioral memories of that individual you love are stored. And you've got cellular memory from the last 3 or 4 biological generations, and you can pass it on to the succeeding 3 or 4 generations. The Kubler-Ross Model, and most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with that. It has been absolutely landmark in helping individuals get ready for their own death, especially when it's chronic illness, they're on hospice. And her model was called the DABDA for the stages that a person goes through when they're facing their own mortality. And I tell you, when a parent dies, that's when I really started facing mine, because I realized, hey, wait a minute. I'm going to be the older generation pretty soon. And that was a bit of a shock. You know, I'm perfectly okay with that, but the first time it really hit me, I thought, whoa, the older generation, they must be talking about somebody else, not me. Because you know, as we get older, our faces may reflect our journey with a few more wrinkles than we were born with. But internally, we rarely feel our chronological age. And all of a sudden you realize that I'm the older generation here. So Kubler-Ross's model, her 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. You know, people say, this isn't happening to me. It can't be happening to me. It must be happening to somebody else. And then they go, it's not fair. I'm mad. How come this is happening to me? And then they try to bargain. Boy, if I do this, maybe that. And there's usually a period of depression as you begin to realize, looks like this is inevitable. And finally you come to acceptance. You know, this is the process of life. You're born, you live, you die. You live on in cellular memory in the bodies of your biological upcoming generations. And I want them to remember me with pleasure. I would hate to think that I died and, you know, one of my grandkids said, well, the old bat finally packed it in. What a relief. It is not one of my goals. But we learned over time that KublerRoss Model didn't work for survivors. It works for the people who are facing personal death, but not for the survivors. Because there's such a vast difference between the grieving process that helps you get ready to die and the recovery process that is effective for survivors, especially if they have some survival guilt, which often happens in car accident episodes, for example. 2 people die and 3 people live. And the people who live say, well, why me? How come I am alive and they're dead? And they can get really stuck in survivor guilt. So we needed a different model for survivors. And that model is what I call the grief recovery pyramid. It's a model for survivors, and it shows the 3 major stages that survivors go through in order to come to acceptance and to moving on in life. You can go to my website and you can look up an article called Grief Recovery Pyramid, and you'll see the pyramid and you'll find the descriptions of the stages, and you will also find strategies to help you deal with the loss and you being a survivor. I have changed the way I look at grief and loss. And I mentioned this earlier. I think there's another way to look at it. Sure, it's sad at the moment. I've lost tangible presence. But this is what I now tell myself. Arlene, waste no time in mindless grieving because it is over. Smile and give thanks because it happened at all. And that's my wish for you. Thank you.
We would like to thank the constituency of the Central California Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church for making this program possible, and from viewers just like you. Thank you.